Episode 3. Michael, how you doing, man?
Doing good. Doing good. We're back. Lots happened since.
So much. Yeah, we're just riffing about it a bit. Yeah, techno optimism, GPTs. But the thing I'm so psyched about, so I was just reading Venkatesh Rao's new piece, Oozy Intelligence in Slow Time. We've been both reading him, and I'm getting to the end of the piece, and I'm like, oh man, he referenced you at the end of the piece. So that was really exciting to see. It was awesome. So and I guess you didn't even know till today, technically, but I know you tagged him in your piece on the Beatles. So that was pretty exciting to see. Yeah, Lucy in the Sky with large language models. And he linked out to you saying, hey, this is sort of my thoughts on newsification. Here's some other people who are experimenting with this stuff. And he mentioned, hey, Michael Dean's writing about this in the context of music. So that must have felt pretty good.
Yeah, totally surprised. And it just goes to show like you should tag the people that you're inspired by in your own work because they might read it, you know?
Yep. Yep.
But yeah, basically he wrote this piece on like ooze to kind of like talk about um AI and yeah, he basically just breaks it down as it's almost like things that used to be kind of larger monolithic break into these smaller miniature blocks that can be rearranged and reassembled
Yeah.
in new ways. Yeah. And the thing that stands out to me, where it's like the object turns into a design grammar, right? Um, and so I just kind of like wrote about AI music, and I think a lot of people are very icky about what that might mean. Like, I think we're kind of forward thinking. So when I bring up a million Beatles songs by 2030, you're like, wow, that's cool. And when I got feedback, everyone was so skeeved out by it. Like they just couldn't like grasp it. And I found that the angle for the piece on AI music is that AI will do to all bands what Acid did for the Grateful Dead, right? And basically, I talk about the Grateful Dead as the band of ooze, and they kind of like fit right into Venkatesh Rao's framework for what ooze is.
You mentioned a fact that the Grateful Dead, what was the exact number? Some insane number of shows that they played, but they ultimately have more than 7,000 hours of music, while the Beatles have 10 hours. Right. We're looking at 2,000 something shows, ends up at about 7,000 hours of music, while the Beatles had 10 hours. And that contrast is fascinating. Like they were oozified pre-AI, and yeah, they happen to use acid to do that. But that contrast was really striking to me. It actually takes the edge off the fear of this Cambrian explosion of, imitative AI driven Beatles music. Cause it's like, whoa, this already exists. The Grateful Dead are absolutely beloved. And there's that guy you mentioned, I forget his name, who's the official record collector of all the different tapes of all the different Grateful Dead concerts. Like knowing that this exists in some form, going back to 1965, in a way is reassuring to sort of calm people down. Be like, hey, like we have a model of what this looks like. And it didn't end the world, it didn't end music as we know it. And you make the case that it turns the listener into a participant. You say it's a fundamental revolution in participation when you have this infinite Beatles as this tool, as this grammar you just mentioned. I like the phrase you had in your piece about the voice of the band, the voice of the Beatles gets sublimated into an instrument. So you mentioned this list of like 20 different forms of Beatles, and some of them can get really weird. And so there's like, it's almost like the variance always increases. There's some weird shit that could be coming from all this, but yet it's quite exciting in the way you frame it. And hopefully the Grateful Dead help people break into this idea without just being freaked out and want to hit the emergency brake.
Yeah, it's the Grateful Dead are a good model, and they were basically writing pop songs, but they were very inspired by jazz, right? Which is kind of like you just go on stage and you figure it out, and it takes on different turns. And so they would take a normal song of theirs. Well, they would just go up, and sometimes they didn't even have a set list. They said, we're just gonna let it all come out. And so while they had a starting point, it would take on these radically different forms. And basically, since you have 700 hours of music, it's up to the fans. It actually requires fans to step up and curate and say, hey, actually that night at 7 that was the best version of this thing.
Yeah.
And the same thing, like Grimes now, she has a few hundred, if not a few thousand people kind of like in that like elevated fan. Like it's not for the mainstream people, it's not going to do anything, but for the hardcore fans, it's like you can really be involved. We're But where I think AI is different is like with the Grateful Dead, you're just a curator.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like it takes tremendous skill to be in the band and improv, and there's a really clear boundary. It's like you only have 6 or 10 guys in the band. But now it's like, hey, like without any permission, you can continue to riff and extend the band in any way you want. And I think there's this real loss of control. You know, like a band is usually 4 guys coming together and making decisions. And the Beatles broke up because they couldn't agree on things like money and taste and direction. And now it's like that'll be the defining feature, where it's just going to be stretched in hundreds of directions, and there won't be a consensus like single version of any band.
So I want to explore the devil. It's really interesting. Obviously, I want to explore the devil's advocating a bit. You mentioned in the footnotes, Yehudis and Garrett were working with you on this piece and sort of pointing out a lot of the, well, wait a minute, what about this? What about that? And I still do want to bring one up that just still jumps to mind for me, even having read your piece, even being generally open to this stuff, which is I would characterize when you turn the Beatles into, when they're, what is your phrase, sublimated into an instrument, I still view this, there's still this distinction in my mind of the original, like the stuff that, Ringo and Paul and George and John recorded in whatever garage in the 60s with the synthetic, the one that's being created by this AI driven instrument. Now, the Beatles, half of them are dead, so like they can never get back together and create more original stuff. But I think it starts to get particularly weird when it's a band that is still playing. Like, I don't know, U2 or whatever. Pick your popular band, Coldplay or something, some popular band. And if you have such an explosion of the synthetic, how does that original stuff still shine out, shine through and break through? Does that distinction matter? Like, I think it seems like it has to, right? Because if this stuff gets good enough and the synthetic stuff is actually indistinguishable from the original, does that not necessarily devalue the original stuff? And this explosion is great and it's so exciting, this and that, but doesn't the original source just get swallowed in the noise?
Yeah, I think right now there is a quality difference. So if you look at the AI Beatles to Jukebox, it is like very different from the canon. But what if they are eventually the same? And like my grandkids, they might not care about the source versus the synthetic, because synthetic is made in their times around the issues that are happening in their life, and they're just more relevant than like culture in the 60s.
Right.
But for a living band, right? Like you're saying U2, what happens there? And like, so Grimes, she has 2 Spotify accounts where it's Grimes and Grimes AI, and she purposely worked it off so that it's different. And she actually took control over the phenomenon. So she says, if you use my tool, right, it's basically some sort of smart contract where she publishes her fans' work onto the Grimes AI account, and then she splits the Spotify royalties with those people. So I think like living bands, if they choose to be progressive, they can actually like work with their fans so that there's a reason to kind of like go through them. And I think you still have this like cultural clout and celebrity status in a way,
Yeah.
For an up and coming band, I'm not so sure. Like if you're just like starting from ground zero, how does AI play into that?
Yeah, because then there's just not enough notoriety for many people to care about the origin. If it is U2 or Coldplay or even Grimes, I mean, she's probably not as popular, but yeah, there's like a relevance there. People care about that original creator, and it is really interesting if you're making music and really feel you're onto something. If somebody just finds you on SoundCloud or Spotify or whatever and just rips your sound, you maybe you're out of luck. It's understandable. I think there's going to be lots of murky waters to process for a long time. I'm also curious, what do you think is the time frame for when the synthetic is indistinguishable from the original? You've spent a lot more time listening to this stuff than I have. I get that there's a quality gap. You're talking about, hey, our grandkids, but the way things are moving, is it not going to be in the next few years, right? You're talking about 2030, you get a billion Beatles songs. Like, I'm just assuming in 5, 7, whatever years from now or sooner, they will become indistinguishable. Is that wrong?
No, I think you're totally right. Like in 2017, there's this group called the Databots, and they actually did like a neural network of the Beatles this is 2017, and it's like basically just static and noise. And you can like, if you listen closely, you can faintly hear the Beatles in there. And that's like them entering the uncanny valley, where it's like this is uncomfortable, but it's kind of them. And I think where it is now, it's like exiting the uncanny valley, where it's like, oh, it sounds like them, but something
Hmm.
is still kind of off. And basically, there's like a few different ways people are using AI, like Jukebox. It captures their sonic imagination and voice, where it
Hmm.
really sounds like their demos,
Hmm.
but it's very low quality. There's other tools where you can actually, in a really polished recording, I could sing and I will sound exactly like John Lennon. But that's less impressive because it's not within their songwriting. You know what I mean? Like there's one version of Yesterday where it's some random guy playing guitar singing Yesterday. And it's like, oh, weird. This is what it would sound like if John sang Paul's version. But through Jukebox, it would say, here's a version of Yesterday as if John Lennon wrote it. And it's a totally different composition. And it's low quality, but it's his voice kind of weaved into these other things. And yeah, basically like you've all of these different approaches to technology and they kind of just need to be wrapped together and fused together. Like
Hmm.
we've had AI Beatles sheet music like since I don't want to say the 90s, but definitely since like 2015, where you could like print out Beatles songs and have humans play them. Um, so if you just fused AI Beatles sheet music with what we have with Jukebox, like that's already, I think that would bring you there.
One of the interesting things you point to in the article was how in the early days of the internet, say 93, and I know you have particular interest in the early days of the internet, which has been cool to
Yeah.
see over the last couple of years. You know, in 1993, you could read the internet. Like you could read the whole thing. You could wrap your head around the whole thing. You make the point that right now, or at least in say recent months, the AI music scene is somewhat similar. You can kind of get a sense on the different tools and the projects that are out there, and that's going to change really soon. Right? If not already, it's starting to really take off. And it is funny, you know, you can go back and read stuff from 93, 94, 95, and people are like, well, if there's this information superhighway with all these web pages, like who's going to read them? Those concerns seem so quaint and petty, and you know, right? It's like imagine somebody trying to process the coming explosion of web pages in like 94, 95, 96, pre-Google. Because right there's
Right.
this problem like, well, what are you just gonna have a million hyperlinks on a page? You have to scroll down and find the right. And then Google comes along and just slices through all that, not to mention, you know, the brand new stuff of ChatGPT with Bing access and stuff. And so we're basically seems to be in this with the AI music, we're just in this time, you know, what's the equivalent of the search engine for this? Like basically, how is demand going to be regulated? You mentioned like upvoting things. It sounds like maybe there's some pages or forums, or you know, you could use an existing forum. You just have like a Reddit Beatles, you know, page or some fan fiction site, which is an upvote function, and that's one way to bottom up to um, steer the demand towards like selecting the best projects or the best experimental pieces. Do you see the Google equivalent as already existing in just like a Reddit style upvote thing, or is there something more sophisticated coming?
Yeah, I really love that analogy to the 90s. And basically, it's like you get the sense that infinite supply is coming, but you haven't yet imagined with this fixed demand, how are we going to match people to this wave of stuff? And Google was one tool, Reddit was one tool, social media is one tool. And I think with AI, you'll have the similar tools, like you'll have search engines, you'll have forums, you'll have people might follow me for my Beatle curations. But I think the main difference is in addition to just searching to seeing what exists with AI, anything you search will just be generated. So I already found this tool. I forget the name of it, but you can specify the kind of podcast you want to listen to and the amount of free time you have. So you can say, I have 5 minutes and I'd love to hear Terrence McKenna riff on Twitter. And then it actually makes that content for you. So with Google, you had to rely on it existing already. With AI, it doesn't matter if it doesn't exist. If I want to hear the Beatles as a 1920s swing band, it will just make that for me.
You know what's funny? That there's some parallel here to Uber. You know, when Uber first came out, and there's this whole thing about ownership is going to go away, and you're just going to rent everything. Like everything just turns into like a service economy. Like what? It's like, oh, why would you why would you own a car? Because it just sits there for 97% of the time, and we'll just have these Teslas we can just call up, you know, on Uber or some equivalent. Do you see this? You see this parallel where it's like, right? What is the parallel? It's like the thing it turns the notion of a thing existing out there that you need to go find into this quaint notion of like car ownership versus just like an automatically generative service that whatever you want, your exact specifications is just delivered to you right away. Whether that, no matter what street you're in America, you can call a car within 5 minutes. Why would you own some clunker sitting in your driveway when no matter where you are, you just get the car and it takes you exactly where you want to be, frictionless, don't even have to pay. That's it. Right? Isn't there a parallel here? But then, I mean, there's a whole bunch of implications. But first of all, I just want to pause there. There's some connection.
Yeah, totally. It's like the on-demand economy. Like if you want something now, you get it. And it started with physical goods. Like kind of the matchmaking has gone from physical to ideas. Right now, it's like, oh, I want some article, some podcast, some song, some movie to exist. Just by, you can basically prompt it into existence.
Yeah, but it's like, does it not necessarily, with everything, there's these trade-offs, of course. So I think the obvious trade-off here is it just takes some value or meaning away from the act of creating itself when everything is just on demand. Like the way a car enthusiast would, who's a tinkerer in his or her garage, just spending all this time, perfecting the engine of their car, all that, like getting the paint job right, placing the sound system, and they would just resent this car on demand because they care about cars, right? Like there's a lot of people who care about the creation for its sake and the process of creation. And you can draw this parallel to music, to film and movies. My film friends here in LA always talk about this, like, oh, it's not gonna be as special if the act of create, does it not devalue the act of creation when you have everything on demand?
Yeah, it's a fair point. And after I read the piece on Oozy Intelligence in Slow Time, he talks about the real intelligence comes not from the sexy work, but from putting in thousands of hours of reps into whatever craft you have. Like I dedicate the way that I think from the thousands of hours I spent in architecture school manually drawing lines. And there's a reason they don't let you use computers, because you need the manual time to etch that way of thinking into your head. And now if you can just press a button and have the building come out based on a prompt, you lose the actual embodied intelligence of how to think through a building. And I totally think it's going to be a problem where people are going to rely on these tools. They're not going to actually have intelligence in the same way that maybe I don't have navigational abilities because I just rely on GPS. Because why do I want to navigate manually when I don't need to anymore?
Right.
So I think it points to a situation where you need to be very mindful of what are the things you want your brain to be enmeshed in the act of doing, and what can you be automating. So for example, at the end of the Beatles essay, I brought up that it took me 25 hours to write this essay. It also takes me 25 minutes to write a song. And I have to, there's opportunity cost for if I'm writing essays, I can't be writing songs. And so the way I see it is it's always worth knowing what is the core thing you want analog mastery in, and you still have to do that without an AI. But man, I would love it if I could just spend 2-3 hours a week on music instead of 25 and 30, and I can be generating albums. Because I have ideas and I have the imagination and the taste, and I've also put in the 10,000 hours into music too. I just don't have a lifestyle now where I can be cranking out hits, So
there's a really interesting distinction there between analog mastery versus, call it digital ease or something like that. You got to get the right term there, but I think about this too. So obviously I loved Venn Katesh's piece on the Oozy Intelligence Slow Time. We should go back and just for a second talk about the exact argument he makes, because independent of the AI stuff, just his reconception of intelligence and what intelligence really is, I mean, the guy just brings the house down with his ideas. I'm every time just floored by his thinking. But obviously I think of this in terms of speaking Chinese. So I've that's where I've done my many thousands of hours for over a decade. I've been studying Chinese, and I just released this week interview with Camellia, our mutual friend Camellia Yang, and I flew to London and we spoke for over an hour in Chinese, no notes, no screens, just sitting there and talking in the recording studio, and it was great. It was one of the great creative moments of my life. It's this culmination of many thousands of hours. I'm so thrilled by it. I'm actually going to China next month. We haven't talked about that, but Anyway,
Cool.
it's just been so rewarding and gratifying to see that play out. And this guy, you maybe know from Twitter, Tom Osman, he's a friend. I was, used to work with him and some Rite of Passage stuff, and just gotten to know him, sort of an online friend, you could say. And Tom has always sort of liked and commented on my Chinese videos. And then the day after I shared that, he shared a video of him using HeyGen to walk through some demo of his in fluent Mandarin. And it sounds really good. And he's never studied Mandarin, 10 minutes in his life. And I think when it first came out, my natural reaction was, man, like, I don't love this. Like, he hasn't put in any time and he's able to just do that. But he just has the digital ease level. But there's obviously a much richer thing there with analog mastery. And I think my mistake when HeyGen first started surfacing about 6-7 weeks ago was, well, does this just invalidate all the time I've put in? And it's like, of course not. There's such a depth and richness that I have access to, whether it's the joy of pursuing the activity itself, the understanding I get of Chinese language and culture from learning the language, the ability to sit in person and communicate and go out to dinner with somebody from China. And, Tom can't do any of that. Now he can do a killer demo that gets, some pickup on Twitter. But do you see this distinction, obviously, of analog mastery versus digital ease? Like, they're both advantageous. They aren't mutually exclusive. It's actually just, I think you're right. You pick your battles. Like, where do you want to still pursue analog mastery? Because there's a rate limiter there. You have to put the time, that type of intelligence, the slow intelligence that VGR talks about. And then where do you want to have digital ease, which isn't zero effort. I mean, there's some effort. He still has to download the HeyGen tool and make the video, it's like, but it's so much easier. So I think you're saying for yourself, you've made the call that you don't have enough time in the day to be an extremely deep, thoughtful writer of ideas, and the same thing for songwriting. So you've made the call that you want to do analog mastery for writing and digital ease for songwriting. And by the way, it's enhanced by your music ability. You're not starting from zero. It probably gives you a leg up. Do you have that right? Do I have that right? And like, I just think this distinction is really interesting.
Yeah, it's the same with AI art for me, where I have a background in drawing and sketching, and I could spend 3 hours on every piece and making a manual piece of art. But it at this point, it makes more sense for me to spend 10 minutes and get, basically the magic trick version of what I could do if I were to dedicate my very limited patience to hand drawing.
So I agree. So here's an interesting question, right? So there's different categories of benefits for doing the analog mastery thing. Okay. And so, but here's my question. And it's a very difficult thing to grapple with. I'm thinking about this a lot myself. So I'm curious how you land on this, right? With analog mastery, there's this set of like categories of benefits. Now, I think, and some are intrinsic, internal, and some are legitimately like external. But I think as the AI capabilities get better, the digital ease version absorbs more and more of the analog mastery benefits. Does that make sense? Like there's this idea in like Richard Dawkins, I think, would always talk about, or like Neil deGrasse Tyson, when they're arguing with like a believer about like religion, they have this idea of the God of the gaps. And I'm not saying I agree with this, but it's just a move that atheists make, where they say, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, God was responsible for all these things. But as say Darwin comes out with, origin of species and like evolution basically takes over some of the responsibilities that used to be attributed to God. And this is sort of more and more and more. And there's this idea of like the God of the gaps. There's almost like this gaps phenomenon with the analog mastery, where right now I speak fluent Chinese, Tom doesn't. He can make a 1-player demo video of himself speaking Chinese. It sounds pretty good, but put him in a room with Camellia, forget about it. Put him at a dinner, forget about it. There's these gaps, but over time, don't those gaps just get absorbed? And do you get to a point where for a lot of domains, the only analog mastery benefit is intrinsic, which is valuable, but it's much smaller than what it is currently, which you have the extrinsic and intrinsic. Do you see that distinction? And like, do you think I'm right in that they just kind of necessarily get overtaken? I want there to be benefits for the analog mastery thing because it's enriched my life so much. I don't want to just be able to push a button and do all these, skills, but I think that the digital ease encroaches on the analog mastery necessarily as time goes on. Do you agree or disagree?
I think I agree. As in, So there's this VR underground VR society. They're already kind of collapsed on itself, but in around like 2000, there was maybe 100, less than 100 people who were spending 4 to 8 hours a day in this VR simulation, and most of them were American and European, but there was also a huge culture in Japan. And like you had these two cultures in this world and they couldn't communicate. So they built a real-time translator so that as someone in English spoke in English, it would render the Japanese like over their head. And so you could picture in 20 or 30 years, if people are wearing AR glasses or even through AirPods, right? You could imagine that eventually that guy could go and talk with Camellia and technology will do the translation.
Right.
That said, I think if you put in all that analog work, like in your case, you have such like the design grammars you've learned from Chinese. It's like it from what I've heard you say, it's like so much is about inflection and it's just so much more intricate. And I feel like the grooves of your brain are different from someone who hasn't studied Chinese.
Yeah.
And it's worth thinking about like how can that be an advantage,
Right.
even outside of speaking Chinese? You know what I mean? Like architecture, for example, the grooves of my brain come from being an architect, and I no longer even practice the craft. But that all the slow work isn't really bound to the domain. You can bring it into other domains, and so I think you do have this big extrinsic advantage of just like there's a certain nature of the slow intelligence you build, and it is just totally independent of that specific craft. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Really well put. I think that's a perfect segue to unpack VGR's piece on Oozy Intelligence, because he does propose a new definition of intelligence, which is what you're just saying. It's the things you learn from patiently pursuing something. It reshapes these grooves in your brain, and I love what you said. It has these benefits outside of strictly the domain itself. So I think it's a perfect segue, and it is encouraging, by the way, because I have put it on all this time. To be clear, like I enjoy it. I mean, we've talked about this a lot offline, I guess you say, but I so thoroughly enjoy just learning Chinese, and it so uniquely fits into things I did in my childhood, whether it's trivia, memorizing pi, things like that. So I would do it regardless. I do genuinely just love it. But you kind of want to have some of those extrinsic benefits as well. You know what I mean? Like I would always say that my primary motivation is internal, and that's still true. But you want those extrinsic benefits as well. And I think your point is that they can exist within the domain of communicating in Chinese and also without, outside that domain too. So yeah, it's really encouraging. But yeah, let's go into Venkatesh's piece. So once again, it's Oozy Intelligence in Slow Time. He just wrote this November 2023. My take on the main argument that he makes is that he just expands the definition of what intelligence is. Like you think most people would say, he says that most people think of intelligence in terms of ability to perform in these moments of peak performance. Like, can you on the spot analyze the situation, have like this aha epiphany? And he's like, no, actually, intelligence is really just steadily deployed attentiveness. He says the aha moments are overrated. And he says that intelligence can be what you're describing, which is whether it's spending thousands of hours learning Chinese, in your case, thousands of hours learning, how to draw these lines by hand or architecture. But in fact, also he even brings it to when you're sleeping. He's like, it's this sort of 24/7 thing where your brain is working on things as you sleep, and that process of rest, like your brain is even processing there. He's working on all these electronics project now. He's like, he dreams about electronics, and he's like, hey, that's actually meaningful. Like my intelligence is this holistic, like 24 hours a day thing. And like, in fact, the aha moments, like he says, oozification, this term he coined, is sort of an aha moment, one would say from the outside, but he's like, that's from a decade of me grinding and patiently churning out idea after idea after idea, creating these grooves in his brain. And then, hey, oozification pops out, but that's sort of a byproduct. The intelligence is the process, which is fascinating. There's so much to go into, but do you think I have that right? Anything you'd add to that initial explanation of what he's arguing here?
This really links into something you introduced to me, and it shows these 4 zones of competence and how you move from unconscious incompetence eventually to unconscious competence. So first you don't know what you don't know, then you're aware of it, but you still can't do it. Then you can do it if you think about it. And then finally, it's just pure automatic mastery. And I think that's really what slow intelligence is. Like, you need to put in the reps to get to that fourth zone where, without thinking, you're doing it in your sleep, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. I love the way he approaches this. 7 years ago, I read Grit by, it's probably back here somewhere, the book Grit by Angela Duckworth. Anyways, it's on book stacks. But and in this book kind of made the rounds. It was this woman, a researcher at UPenn, and she's just saying that grit is this thing, it's this intersection of passion and perseverance that makes people stand out and be successful. And she had this phrase I love called the mundanity of excellence. So I think it's like a fairly common concept that people know about, right? Like you put in your 10,000 hours, go with the Gladwell 10,000 hours and all that. But the distinction that Venkatesh makes, he's saying most people just call that like stamina. It's like, oh, you're conscientious. And he's like, no, that's intelligence. Like that's actually more of intelligence than just like your raw IQ ability to like on the spot take something on. And I, as someone who read that book, got super inspired, and then has spent, 7 years and then even more than that studying Chinese, it's really gratifying to be like, oh wait, I'm actually like developing this slow glacial like intelligence that most other people don't have in this one domain. Also, building rite of passage is another one. What do we always say? Great product is subtlety compounded over time. The details are the difference. Like that's 4 years, but myself, David, you have just spent so many collectively thousands of hours improving that product. Like that work is a form of intelligence. It kind of elevates that work, and it knocks the on the spot raw cognitive ability off its pedestal. But I mean, I think that stuff is still smart, but it was sort of gratifying to be like, wait a second, like these things I've been doing, you've been doing for X number of years, we've actually just been like honing this form of intelligence without maybe explicitly realizing that.
Mm-hmm. It shows that intelligence is programmable, which is kind of neat. Like you're not really stuck with this hardware. Like whatever your IQ is, you can. That's like really the starting point. Yeah. I'll just share this. Like, I remember like when I first learned about IQ as a kid, you take these tests and it's like, oh, okay, I have an IQ like 120. That's like a normal, smart person, okay, whatever. And like, I feel like in architecture school, something like changed in my head, and like I see the world differently. And I took an IQ test recently, and my math and my verbal, they were still in 120, which like I've had since a kid, but my spatial IQ was hit 149. Where it's like, huh? It's like I bet you that I don't know if I measured that back then, but it's almost like that would really support this idea of oozy intelligence, that a number can kind of go up through just like extreme immersion in something.
Yeah. Well, it's empowering to know that, because it's so easy to think of intelligence as just this number you're born with, and it right. Can't. It's definitely not the case. That's really interesting. I'm not surprised your spatial so high, by the way, having seen you map out live essays and things like that.
And you can never trust these tests, by the way.
So it's a proxy. Yeah, it gives you a ballpark probably, but I think that's really neat. It reminds me of a few other things. One, I think I saw Paul Graham saying this on Twitter recently, but often, I think it was a Paul Graham clip that went around Twitter this week, but basically just saying, if you're an entrepreneur and they have a 10 out of 10 intelligence, but like a 7 out of 10, what do you call it, like drive or like desire to succeed, he'd much rather have a 7 out of 10 or even a 5 out of 10 intelligence and a 10 out of 10 drive and desire, right? Like, there's definitely some parallel there, because just the desire or drive expressed over time is this stamina, which Venkatesh is saying is actually intelligence. The contrast of this, I sent you a piece by this guy, one of my new favorite online writers, Gurwinder. Yeah, you might have seen it on Twitter, and he's got a Substack and stuff.
Yeah.
Great thinker out of the UK. Really like his stuff. And he, saying what I sent you, the TikTok is a ticking time bomb piece, which for so many other reasons is a great piece. But one of the things he says is that consuming that type of content, it sort of turns your brain to mush. And maybe that's not the most, that point is like out there in the zeitgeist. People have heard that, but if you really think about it, like there's actually brain scans that show like a decreasing volume of gray matter when you're swiping after a certain number of hours or a certain number of months or years. And it's quite the opposite of this form of intelligence that Venkatesh is talking about. I mean, it reminds me of the book Flow. We've talked about this a lot, but what's so great about a flow state isn't just, oh, it feels good or you're being productive. No, when you're in a flow state, you're combating the psychic entropy that is your brain's default state. Like your brain sort of tends towards disorder, towards worry, whatever, and you watch TV or you scroll your phone, that mutes that. But when you enter a flow state, when you're writing or doing architecture, when I'm learning Chinese, you're actually creating new structures metaphorically and literally at the, in the neuronal level in your brain. And so anyways, I'm not surprised that after, so many years of being an architect and all that, your spatial intelligence has gone up because you're creating new structures in your brain. And that's just a really exciting thing to know that you can do that. You can just choose to deploy your attention in a way that you just walk away a lot smarter, a lot sharper. One other thing, sorry, there's a lot of associations here, but Rob Henderson is a great Substack writer, and he just wrote a piece about deep reading. I don't know if you saw that one. And same idea, like he's just saying how when you meet somebody, you can tell if they're a deep reader or not. Like do they read books and grapple with them, and it changes the gray matter in your brain. It changes how you come across in conversation. You can tell when people have flimsy ideas versus they really have this groundedness and depth in thinking. So Venkatesh has all these insights about what this means for how we think of AI. So we can talk about that in a second, but anything else to say on purely on the intelligence argument without the AI stuff? His piece is so good. Just on the intelligence front. Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts there?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I don't know if IQ is actually changeable. Like there's a chance that I just never measured my spatial. Like that actually wasn't even a thing, as much of a thing in the past. But what I think he brings up at the very end, where the way that we've conceived AI, the intelligence of AI is very anthropomorphic. He says AI is forcing us through this Copernicus type moment where we are, just kind of like redefining what intelligence is. I wanted to add just like 2 points to like kind of riff on what you said. One of them was this idea of like deep reading versus social media. And part of a flow state is being slightly challenged, like not challenged enough where you stop, but just to the level where you can keep going and solve something. And I feel like TikTok is the kind of thing where through the nature of video, you can just receive it without really doing anything. Whereas recently, like the other day, I'm like trying to hit inbox 0 on Substack, which is pretty damn hard. But like to catch up, it was Friday morning, and I just read Substack for like 6 hours straight. And it really fried my brain. Like I don't have that kind of stamina, and like really hurt, and it kind of ruined my day.
Wow.
But it's interesting to me where it's like, that is so, like you can watch 6 hours of video and it's a very different kind of feeling because you're not actually actively like processing information through text, which is really this kind of difficult thing to parse through. And like part of me, like I think intuitively you'd be like, oh, like that hurt my head, I should stop doing that. But it's almost like that's the stretching of your ability. Whereas if I keep doing that the first 5 times, it might hurt, but eventually I can read for 6 hours straight with no problem. It reminds me of like drumming. Like when I started drumming, my hands would be bleeding after 30 minutes. I'd have to open doorknobs with my elbows, and like now I have callus and I can just do it no problem for as long as I want.
You callous your mind. That's that's a David Goggins thing, but he talks about, actually it's funny. I read that David Goggins book when it came out like 5 years ago, and he would always talk about in terms of like running, like marathon running. And I don't care about marathon running personally. It's not right now, maybe one day, but I always thought to myself, like, what is my equivalent of like Goggins, like doing 20 miles a day for a year straight or whatever? And I basically landed on for myself, it was learning Chinese. And I've now done that. Right. And I have calloused my mind in that way. And you're talking about that in terms of reading. I totally agree. It's such it's like we were saying before, it has intrinsic and external benefits. You feel good. I mean, look, I guess you're saying you did 6 hours, you're like exhausted, but I don't know, maybe you felt good.
6 hours, like without looking away. Like I can get into tunnels like that. So
It's
a different problem.
Yeah, but overall, I'm sure if you keep that habit up, and I'm sure you will, that you ultimately feel great. You will feel great from doing that. Like it's edifying. You're growing your capabilities and things like that. You're callousing your mind, and watching TikTok for 6 hours is the exact opposite, whatever that would be.
I have a question for you actually, because callousing the mind, I'm wondering, is there, well, my question actually is, do you dream in Chinese?
Not often. I have a couple times, and I was pretty, man, the first time it happened, I was like jumped out of bed, I pumped my fist, I was psyched. Um, not often. I mean, it's probably count on one or two hand, single digit number of times it's happened. Um, I also think that I just wrote a piece last week about how my Chinese practice sort of ebbs and flows in the stock market. And so I think it's more likely when I'm really in it. I'm going to be in China for 2 weeks this December, and I'll be studying a lot more Chinese now that the cohort's over leading up to that. And I think it's more likely that it would happen in that stretch versus say the last 5 weeks when I've just been keeping the baseline. But yeah, to answer your question, a couple times, I would love to do it more because I think it's pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you?
I think and this is a working idea, but those moments where you're obsessed with something and then you dream about it, the dream is the sign that a callus has been formed.
Nice.
Right? Because I've had maybe 5 dreams throughout my life. And these are always after I'm really analyzing and dissecting the craft, trying to understand rhythm and like patterns in Kurt Vonnegut's writing. But whenever I do that for like 1 or 2 days straight, like that's my main focus, I'll have these dreams the next morning where my eyes are closed and like text is being presented to me, and I have the experience of reading, but it's semantically nonsense, but it's like syntactical mastery. So it's like it's perfectly structured gibberish, if that makes sense. And I'm not thinking it or imagining it, it's just being presented to me. And it's like really wild.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I mean, what I remember as a kid, I was obsessed with chess. I played a ton of chess. I played in these tournaments and stuff, and I'd be falling asleep. And it's like when you go skiing and you can feel yourself on the slope as you're falling asleep. Or if you're on a roller coaster all day and you feel the drop as you're falling asleep. It's sort of like you described. I would just feel the chess in my head. It almost sounds weird to say, but that's what it was. And it wasn't specific moves and specific games, but my mind was just like running on this chess wavelength. So yeah, I mean, I think there's parallel there. That is interesting, as that being a signal of the callus forming. I think it's a pretty cool idea.
But even like if it's a change in pattern, like there's two other experiences like that in recent times where generally, on a work day, we're having a one-on-one conversation. I'm at a computer, I'm with my wife. There was one day where I went to a family barbecue out east on Long Island, and I was just surrounded by family for 10 hours straight. There's a lot of ambient conversation wherever I was, and going to sleep, I would just be hearing voices all night as it was like continuing on from the day. And another time I did this like big hike up Mount Shasta. And so it was another thing where I'm in nature for 8 or 10 hours, and going to bed, there's this weird experience of just like leaves, or it's like this natureness in trying to go to bed, So it's like, even if you're not trying to master it, it's like what Venkatesh Rao was saying, just like by pure slow immersion into something, even if it's just a temporary variance from where you are, that like change is enough to really register something.
And it's really interesting. And the contrast in my mind is when I do have this will happen to me when I'm, I don't use TikTok, but YouTube Shorts, whatever. I'll have nights where I just spiral and spend hours on that. And often it's on my phone. It's on my computer or my TV or something. It's just, and I don't know if maybe you're more disciplined than me, but this will happen to me at times. And then I'll be trying to fall asleep and forget, like, even just soaking your brain in blue light for 3 or 4 hours. And I feel like my brain is revving. It's like an old PC or something. If you have a bunch of windows open, like the fan like revs and it gets all hot. Yeah. I feel like my brain's like that. It's the exact opposite. It's just this awful feeling. You just can't focus. It's the exact opposite. So it's sort of like the two sides of the coin there. But hey, let's talk about the implications that this conception of intelligence that Venkatesh argues what this means for how we interpret AI. I think one interesting thing is he unpacks the idea of patience. Like he is an example of electronic parts for his electronic tinkering, and he'll get these cheap boxes of 50 different parts from China, and he doesn't want to Google each little part number and look up what he does, but he can just send it all to AI and it'll just instantly tell him what it is. And he says it's that type of work is below the patience threshold for human attention. Time is expensive for humans, but AI can do an hour's worth of work in a minute. And he says that this ability to process high detailed bandwidth, like cranking through a huge volume of detail, is a form of slowing down time. And so AIs have this speed of patience. So he says patience isn't just the ability to tolerate boredom, it's also the ability to tolerate an excruciating level of detail, where there's this extreme fine amount of detail in anything. Like paint drying is boring. Humans don't have the patience to watch paint dry, but at the atomic level, drying paint is fascinating. Or like a still cup of water is boring. You just look at it, but there's insane microbial swirling if you zoom in enough. And so I just took that this was one of his things about his interpretation of AI is that it has a higher capacity for patience, and it's the slowest tempo you can tolerate something at the final level, finest level of detail you can handle indefinitely. So it's that intersection of time and capacity for or ability to handle detail, and AIs are extremely patient in this way. I thought that was really interesting. He then does talk about how humans can have the same patience in developing these analog mastery that we're just talking about. But any reflections on his definition of patience there?
When he talks about the patience, is he talking about there's two ways that I'm thinking of it. I'm not sure which one he means. One is in the training of the models, as in you're just loading billions of words into it and it can do it 24/7. And at the end, it is this embodied master, as similar to a human who, went through the slow time. Basically, you could think of in the training sense in AI, it's almost like it has the resources to, like, where we have this very finite band of attention where we can have slow intelligence. Its training is its slow intelligence, right?
Right.
And then the other way to look at it is really that metaphor he used for the superhero in the movie who freezes time and then goes around, runs all the errands, like puts people in funny positions and then unfreezes it. The other type is from the prompter's end. You could ask it a question and it will do an hour's worth of work for you and basically just enable you to like just pick up as if you would work for an hour. It's just been a minute for you.
Yeah. Well, I think I have a note here. It says AI has a higher speed of patience. It's the rich detail it has access to, plus the infinite time to pay attention to that. So to me, the answer is both. And the first piece is the rich detail. It just has this, it's scraped the entire web, the entire internet. And then it has the ability to infinitely pay attention to it. I've talked to Taylor Foreman about this, the right brain versus the left brain. It's almost like the right brain side is just the full landscape of all things that have ever been written on the internet. And then the left brain is like a specific request to then deploy that based on a given prompt. And it has the patience to read all this stuff in the first place, combined with the patient and access to that, combined with the patience to, you can prompt it 75 times in a row, and any reasonable human would tap out maybe after 20, whereas it can just keep going and going and going. So that's my understanding of it. He also makes
it like in every dimension. It's just by nature of being a machine, it doesn't. There's very biological reasons why we don't have patience. Whereas like it's probably in many ways it can just play these long games that humans can't.
Totally. It totally outstrips us in that way. As I'm thinking about the piece, I'm like, what was his final claim? The real takeaway insight I took was really about understanding human intelligence. I'm just looking through my notes again here. He has this interesting point. He talks about Moravec's paradox, which is the fancy way of saying, say 20 years ago, we thought AI would have a really hard time with conventionally hard things like winning a game of chess. It can actually do that quite easily. And it really struggles with easy things like opening a doorknob or like identifying objects in a room or something. And so he talks about that just basically as an example of there's a parallel to human intelligence where we think the hard thing is like the aha epiphany moment. That'd be like winning a game of chess. When in reality, maybe the hardest thing is the stamina, is like getting enough sleep for your brain to process it. Like that's the same as opening a doorknob. So I thought that was really interesting. He maps like this paradox in AI and computing to this sort of the paradoxical nature of human intelligence. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But like, I'm actually looking through, I'm like, what was his central claim? He basically just says that our current frames on AI intelligence are popular because they affirm our egocentric identities, but like, and so we should have new frames for thinking about AI intelligence, but and let go of these anthropocentric conceits is what he says. But I actually don't, I think he said at that list at the end, he was like, 10 bullets of how I'm thinking about intelligence. It's 80% done. I'm still
Yeah.
there's basically, I'm just realizing as we're talking through it again, I don't know that he has one single claim about what this means for how to think about AI intelligence. Maybe I'm forgetting it. What do you think?
I think there's like at least two very different points. One is how the fact that he doesn't have to, there's like this problem where it's like, I forget how you said it before, the little parts of the machine. And like, he would never do that. It's not worth his time. But now that it's so cheap, it enables him to have fun with the thing.
Right.
So one side of it is, since AI has this infinite patience, it allows people to do more. And another example of me is like, oh, with that song, right? I don't have 25 hours, but I have 30 minutes. And if I could write full songs at perfect quality in 30 minutes, like, oh, I'm going to do that, of course. But then the other side of it is almost like just about intelligence itself, and saying how it's about this slow, laborious, tedious kind of just do the work, put in the reps, and you're going to learn something. And to me, that was the case on why you shouldn't use AI. And I think there's even a danger where if people are just if people have access to an Uzi intelligence that knows everything, gives them everything instantly, they're not going to develop it themselves.
Yeah. They'll retreat to what we were saying earlier. What did we call that earlier? They'll retreat to only a life of digital ease, and they'll totally neglect the analog mastery. You know what's interesting? Yeah. Okay. I think we got it. This is what he's saying about let go of the anthropocentric conceits. What's the anthropocentric conceit of AI? It's saying that AI takes care of all the annoying schlep and leaves humans just to have these epiphany of insight after insight after insight. Like that's like a very elementary reading of how AI and humans are going to interact. It's like black and white. It's like a ketchup and French fries understanding, right? His Michelin understanding is a lot finer grained, and he's saying AI doesn't just come along and like vaporize all the schlep, and you can just sit there and just have insight after insight because that's what humans can do that machines can't do. He's really making this case that it is that mundanity of excellence, the schlep is the intelligence for humans. So it's not as simple as, AI just takes care of all the annoying stuff and humans just have the epiphanies. There's a real richness and realness to human intelligence that's built through the schlep that actually is a more fundamental type of intelligence in many ways. And so, yeah, I don't know if he even explicitly makes that conclusion, but it's saying, don't just kick back and let AI do all the dirty work for you. The dirty work is the intelligence, basically, which again is both practitioners of mundanity of excellence and analog mastery. It's a pretty nice message to get.
Yeah. And the way I see it is, you have this kind of, imagine a super intelligence who infinite patience and anyone can access it. The person who also went through, put in the reps and has their own slow intelligence, they're going to be making things that are much, like when you fuse them with that AI intelligence, what they can make is so much better. You know what I mean? Like someone who hasn't done any work, you give them an automatic building generator or song generator, an essay generator. They don't even know kind of how to direct this infinite intelligence.
Yeah. I mean, I necessarily, naturally bring it back to Chinese. It's like Tom Osman does this video, him speaking Chinese, but like, so he can do that. But like AI for just in my own Chinese practice is revolutionary. Just in the last month, the way I study Chinese has been completely flipped around because I can have on-demand access to any list of vocab I ever want. I don't have to go digging through a textbook or some website to find a list of vocab for a given topic. In terms of letting me sifting through hundreds of podcast episodes, finding the ones I want to listen to, in terms of even having like an on-demand tutor I can talk to if I want to do the ChatGPT voice thing. So I think that's a good conclusion to draw from this. It's if you pair the AI intelligence with the analog mastery, it's just gonna be way more effective than just sticking to the digital ease thing. So
right. And like the tide will rise, and people who have no talent or ability will be able to appear as if they are as good as a normal artist today. But the artists who use the tool, like, I think AI will lead to a historic explosion in the nature of art and in the quality of art that we make. And it's not going to be by the new people who just jump into Midjourney. It's going to be by the artist who's been doing this for 20 years, who now is not even using Midjourney. He trained his own model and he has his own tool, and he can just make something beyond what we even think art is.
Because that guy has done the schlep, because
Exactly.
that guy's done the 10,000 hours. And we, that's his fundamental claim in this article, is that we overrate the peak performance. Because if it was just the peak performance, then you just get any high IQ individual, plug them into Midjourney, and they can just have those epiphanies and make some, radically new art or whatever. And I think he's saying instead, yeah, like the thing is the 10 years. I did come back to this question earlier too. Is like, is there some point at which the digital ease thing is just so good, it actually just overtakes all the advantage of the analog master? I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know, some of the most interesting AI questions I think I've stumbled upon maybe in the last few months.
Yeah, it's like, I remember when GPT came out in 2020, end of 21, right?
No, end of 22.
Oh my
That's not long ago. It was a year ago. Less than a year ago. GPT 3.5.
Yeah, wow. I just remember that it was GPT-3 at that time, and it was so bad at doing voice impressions. It's like, oh yeah, that's not gonna happen. And then just a few months later, 4 comes out, and it still can't do it, but it's noticeably better. And you bet in the next 2 years, you're gonna have perfect imitations of writing voice.
100%. Man, I was writing I just wrote it. I woke up one morning, just had this idea for a short little piece about, it's not even important what it's about, but I part of the piece, some imaginary figure traveled back 100 years ago to 1923. And then I had a scene in there where the guy who's from 2023 is like saying something to this crowd, and then a kid from 1923 steps up and sort of puts the guy from 2023 in his place a bit. And I wanted to have like language that sounded like the way like a 15-year-old kid in like Haddon, who's like an immigrant, would sound. And I kind of wrote some version of it, stuck in a GPT, and it was about 10 times better than what I would have come up with. And that's a relatively easy imitation because it's not an individual. Right. But that was sort of like, oh wow moment, this definitely caught my attention. That is just in that narrow domain, I was able to do it genuinely better than I could have in a tenth of the time.
Yeah. So what then if analog mastery doesn't matter?
I don't know. It's a pretty radical thing to conceive of. I mean, I haven't thought that real quick. There's another parallel we can draw here to movies. Somebody had a thread, might have been an Eric Howell piece. I don't know. I saw something this week about, I think Eric Howell linked to an old piece he had written about CGI in movies and how if you go back, I mean, I remember as a kid watching Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, all the droids and everything are real metal versus the newer stuff, everything CGI. And even as a kid, I was like, when the newer ones came out with just CGI, something felt off. And there's all these movies. What do you say? Dune. He compared Dune to Lawrence of Arabia. And Lawrence of Arabia was like my dad's favorite movie. It was like 1964. And Dune was like 2022. And like Lawrence of Arabia looks better because it's shot in an actual desert with the actual sand and everything, versus Dune, it was all computer generated. And his point was that still to this day, your brain is really smart. You can just tell there's this intuitive thing. It just knows if it's seeing something real or not. And because of that, a movie from 55 years ago, or however long was it, 58 years ago, 59 years ago, looks better than a movie that was shot last year. And his big conclusion is that directors are just kind of lazy. Like it takes a lot of money and effort to like go to Saudi Arabia or whatever and film this thing versus just stitching it all together in a studio in Hollywood. And so one argument is that it's just harder to close this gap than we think. I don't know the answer, because the other answer is that this stuff's just accelerating like crazy and the gap closed, this decade. So that's one thing. What's that?
There's one question, can you close the gap? And then if they do close the gap,
so just address first, now let's go to the second one. If the gap closes, like, we'll see. Like, I don't know, man. It's like, there's different domains, and like, it's sort of interesting to think like, where would the gap close first? At first, I was sort of, this past March, when GPT-4 came out with writing, I was obviously a big concern. Now, when I read like a Venkatesh type piece, I'm like, this is going to, and he even said he thinks it's quite a long way from totally replicate. Okay, this is an interesting misnomer, maybe. Have you seen the things where people talk about AI? Like Tim Urban or somebody will have sketch out like a scale of like intelligence, and it'll be like this huge like curve. And then it'll say like, like the lowest like troglodyte like human is here, and then like Einstein is like here. And their point was that there's very little gap between the lowest and the highest, and it's just going to blow past it right away. That's proving to not be true. Like I don't actually think that's right, and I think AI's ability is really jagged, and so are humans. And the best humans at the best of what they do in writing or whatever these domains, I think is quite a long way off from being replaced. That still doesn't answer the question of what if it does happen, and is it in what domain does it happen? I don't know. What do you think? What do you think happens when it surpasses? That's like the question, right? I mean, in some sense, that's what the AGI fears. It just surpasses us in every way. But I guess it would probably, the dominoes would fall in these subdomains first. But what do you think?
It's such a hard question. One way to think of it is if everyone had the power to do everything and anything they wanted to, then it's almost like your path depends on your ability to utilize your attention in every possible moment. Like attention and decision is the only real constraint anymore. Like, oh, you can make a symphony and I can make a symphony. You can make an essay and I can make an essay. It's like, do you have someone who's just like kind of with ADD, just like jumping from brilliant thing to brilliant thing and not making momentum? Or do you have someone who can strategically, with infinite power, somehow chain them together into a narrative, into a career, into a brand? So it's like, it just reduces the last bottleneck is like our actual attention.
That's the finite. That's the thing that's until we hear better, until we hear otherwise, it's still fixed. Like that is still like the biological bottleneck, right?
Yeah, but then what if you, for example, I could build an agent that could just be generating essays continuously, and then I can go and do other things. So there becomes to a point where you can create a synthetic version of yourself that is still working for you. And so it's almost like it's not even just you, it's you and the infinite like army of you that you create and what you're doing. And at a certain point, that's so abstract where you have these selves that aren't you producing work in the name of you. And then it's like that kind of whole paradigm feels like it strips away the intrinsic joy, and it's more about like, oh, I'm building this extrinsic empire of myself.
Oh, yeah. What, man, two things. So one, there is a resilience to the status quo that maybe we underestimate. One example I think is very interesting. I was reading Bezos's old shareholder letters, and when the Kindle's coming out in like I think 06 or 07, he's just like, look, guys, we are extending the book, or like we are improving the book, and we're gonna rattle a lot of feathers, we're gonna ruffle a lot of feathers, upset a lot of people, but Kindle is actually better than conventional books in all these different ways, and just like wake up world, here we come. And people thought that publishing was just going to like disappear, and like book publishing has proven to be really robust. And so I do think when this new stuff comes out, there's like this hype cycle. It's like everything's gonna be different forever, no matter what. And then there is this resilience of, I don't know what you want to call it, tradition or conventional norms, conventional ways of doing things. Now, can that hold up in say age? That's the age-old question. Is this time different? But that's one thing, is that there's this resilience that maybe we underestimate. On the flip side, what you're describing, if you do hit that point where you're generating infinite stuff, and then you can have agents that represent you that are consuming infinite stuff, that's if it really does play out that dramatically different, that's when you get into the argument I love about Tim Urban, like the die progress unit, where in our lifetime we'll hit a level of change in the technologies that we interact with that would be the equivalent of say 1750 to 2023. Like it's paralyzing to even consider that that's possible, but it is possible. And that's, I think, when Sam Altman and these different people say, look, nobody knows what's coming, that's a version that's possible. It would just, it's, what it would be called? It would be called the oozification of everything. It's just everything oozifies. That's the way Vic describes it. And things are just like totally unrecognizable. I guess like there are like the parameters of like physics and biology and things that keep things within some reasonable window of recognizability, but then maybe not. Maybe it's, I don't know. You can just sort of lose solid ground really quick in this type of conversation. But the short answer is I have no idea, and we will all find out together.
Whatever happens, there's going to be a coexistence of the two things. Like right now, you have traditional books and you have Substack and you have ebooks, there's actually a whole range of types of digital forks off of the book,
Yeah.
and the book still exists and all its new permutations exist.
Yeah.
And so we're just going to enter this world where the creative technological people who embody AI will take on this new form, this new kind of entity where it's, you go to someone's website, it's like, huh, they have like 10 billion words on here, and instead of like a feed of their issues, it's a search feed. And by me searching like this, now I'm now in conversation. I don't know what form it'll take, but it's like you're gonna have that, and some people are gonna hate that, and
Yeah.
it's gonna be overwhelming to some people. And they're just give me my book, you know.
Yeah.
And it's just, and that's just in the realm of books, but like,
Right.
there's I think we're entering this point where the divide between the analog and the technological are going to be so extreme that it could, in this century, be the defining rift between people.
Yeah.
As in, right now, it's kind of, you have the left and right, you have religions, you have all sorts of ways people are in tension with each other.
Yeah.
But I think just with the range of, or the intensity of change that might come, you're going to have the brain chip people versus the non-brain chip people, and they're going to like really hate each other.
Isn't this the premise of Dune? I've never read Dune. I don't know if you have. One of these sci-fi stories, it's the sort of neo-Luddites versus the adopters. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's some version that kind of, I don't know if that's, I think that's
There's a
Dune.
book called, I think it's Shy Matrix. It's like Bruce Sterling from 1985, and it's like basically the cyborg people. Like in the end, they're both extremely advanced, but one thinks we should still have some form of a body, and the other says we don't even need bodies anymore. We're just in a server floating in space, and we are just disembodied consciousness, and we live in our own kind of synthetic utopia.
Yeah, that's like the Robin Hanson, like Age of M's. I haven't read that either, but that gets referenced a lot. It's that same idea. I have to trust that that's outside our lifetime. I think. I don't know. At some point, you have some solid ground to hang on to. I don't know. I guess you just never know for sure. But I guess one lesson maybe we can draw from the book thing is that it's very tempting. The Kindle comes out and it's like, all right, books are done. Like Kindle's here. Like it's move over, and it's so much messier than that. I mean, not to mention adoption over space. Like in certain parts of the world, Kindles don't even exist or are hardly used, probably, right? Or just getting access to books or whatever. I don't know. So I think that it's so tempting to just paint in the absolute broadest brush, and it's always messier than that. But maybe over the decade, it's just that's the big question for me, is always how much of this will actually come to pass in our lifetime. One thing that's interesting, you ever see those graphs? We probably wrap up soon. If I don't know if we want to save the more conversation for another day. We go for a long time here. But one thing I just thought of that I always find interesting, there's these graphs of like Tyler Cowen or Steven Pinker, these different people will share these graphs at times of, or Alex Tabarrok, like GDP, global GDP or something, like over the centuries. And it's like, they go like 10,000 BC to present. And it's just like, and there's a lot of other things. Population follows this curve. It's just like all these different trends are just flat. And around 1700, it just goes vertical. It's basically Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, and all that. But I always think about it. There's still many generations of people born, lived, and died who just were. It was just stepping. If it goes from A to Z, they were just going from D to E to F. It was whole lifetimes just to make each little leap that eventually became this just infinitely accelerating curve. Does that make sense? So it's still spread out over many lifetimes. And you knew if you were living in like 19th century England or something that things were changing. Oh man, we got maybe early in your life, the train gets introduced. If you live long enough towards the end of your life, the automobile comes out. But like, it still took many generations. When you zoom out, it's really fast, but it doesn't feel quite so fast when you're zoomed in. But the question is this just nature of acceleration is that the rate of change gets faster with each passing generation. So that's the Tim Urban thing, is that 1700 to 2000 degree of change then compressed into one lifetime. It's just destabilizing to think about, but I suppose it's possible. So
yeah. I have a post-it somewhere, but I threw it out, but it is that chart, and then it circles the bend. And so basically it's a flat line, and the flat line is prehistory. And then the little knob, little turn is history, and then the vertical line upwards is post history. And Terrence McKenna has this line, it's like we're basically like escaping history. And like the way I think of it is like history is this womb that like kind of like fosters consciousness until it escapes space-time. Like that's kind of like where we're going. In this, eventually there's going to be this realm where it's not even exponential, it's just straight up, you know. And it's just weird to think of, like, we think we've seen history as this linear process, but we're just passing the point where it's like, wait a second, it's not like every century subtle change. We're like we're beyond the halfway point of history, if not in the very last hours of it, you know.
And say it again, the history is a
History
womb.
is the womb that fosters consciousness until it escapes space-time.
That's why we do this, you know, an hour in. That's just unbelievable, man. One thing that reminds me of is, yeah, it's all about the level of scale at which you view something. Because to most people, it's like history is the most fundamental thing there is, but there actually was no history until what man started farming, you know,
Yeah.
what, 10,000 BC, let's say. Like, okay, 300, this is the premise of the gossip trap from Howell. It's 300,000 BC to 10,000 BC. That's 290,000 years. There kind of was no history. I mean, like a little, but it's so the change was so imperceptible that there was, I mean, there's certainly no self-awareness of history. We can go back and sort of map it on. Oh, well, it was like, you know, Australopithecus into Neanderthal into, you know, Homo sapien or something. But so history is, that's what's so fascinating. You can just, it's a Google map effect. You can just zoom out or into any like level of resolution at which to look at these things. And so, because the average person on the street, you say history is just this temperate, it's like, what? History is all there is. It's like, no, you just zoom out or zoom in a little more. What it reminds me of is when I got really into the sovereign individual 4 years ago or so, I read that book, and this idea that the nation state is just like a temporary, you call it a womb or what, if you want to call it that, but it, like the nation state kind of sort of only exists, depending how you want to count it, either since 1648, Westphalia, Peace of Westphalia, end of the 30 Years' War, or like the end of the French Revolution led to a lot of formation of nation states. So whether you want to count back, what is that, 230 years or more like, what is that, 370 years or something, like that's relatively short. And like nation states were nonsensical to somebody, even in say 15th century Italy, not to mention the Greeks or, you know, Europe, you know, the Dark Ages or something. And so does that make, do you see the parallel there where it's like,
Yeah.
nation state is actually potentially just this blip and we revert back. Industrialization, we've talked about this, where industrialization seems like the final form, but if you zoom out enough, it's like everything is like decentralized, like hunter-gatherer, and then you sort of, it's like bundling and unbundling. You bundle up into the city, and then with Wi-Fi and just different things, like you actually unbundle. So it's just, maybe there's a term for this, but it's like the thing that you think is like the fundamental substrate of reality actually just might be this like relatively temporary blip when viewed at the right level of resolution. That's pretty fascinating.
It's a beeper. It's a pass-through entity. Like if you think of all the structures that we hold sacred, they're actually just like temporary things that we use to jump onto the next thing.
Would you say it's a beeper? Like it's like, is that, you mean like the beeper that was like pre cell phone?
Yeah. Like the beeper helped us get from we're like a state of pre-global communication to just rapid global communication. And like it's crazy that history or the military or just these things that have been around, they're just like, if you zoom out enough, it's a beeper. And there will be a future form of humanity potentially that doesn't have any of that.
And the thing about the beeper, it's so inconsequential in hindsight. Like I barely remember that existed. I think what doctors use that, and like say like it was like 1990 and a doctor was on call, they'd use a beeper, right? And at the time, it probably seemed like this remarkable technology that revolutionized how medicine could be done or something. And it's
really, it was a one-way technology.
I was like, did you misspeak? Beeper, but it took me a second. Like, it's so there's such a over fitting to the time which you live. I mean, naturally we do this, but another thing from Venkatesh, one time he just made this point that really almost bothered me. He was just like, yeah, in terms of like history, like the 2000s and 2010s are just going to be remembered as like pretty irrelevant. Like there was this one terrorist attack in 2001, there was a financial recession, but like not that much is happening right now. And I was like, what do you mean? Like everything's been happening in the last 20 years, but it's if you zoom out enough versus like World War II or the Cold War. So anyways, there's a lot of parallels there too. That's fascinating, dude, the beeper effect.
Yeah. And the creepiest thing is you can say that a beeper is a pass-through entity, or that nation states are a beeper, or you could say history itself
Where you
is a
going?
temporary phase we're passing
Here you
through.
go.
You could even say that humans are past their entity, and it's
Oh,
really language itself. Like there's this, I think the first line of, I forget which part of the Bible, but it's like first there was
the word.
the word, and then the word was God, and the word was God. And it's like it's all about like the story of everything is how language just gets into higher and higher forms of order, and it kind of like a virus, it takes over humans. And you see what happens once we get language, and we create the machines that create more sophisticated forms of language. And in that book, where like in this sci-fi book, they show eventually that humanity is just like consciousness living in a server in space. And it's bizarre, but it's post-humans, but it's just these extremely precise constellations of language, and it's transhuman, and it's weird, but it's like that's kind of that's the extreme end of the Beeper effect, that there's a post-human future.
Yeah, man. It's fascinating. It is unsettling. I have two thoughts here. One, this reminds me of a couple of things. It reminds me of our friend Taylor Forman's point about like narrative is the most real thing. Like one time we were like debating the existence of God at like a restaurant in LA, and he goes, dude, what's more real? This bottle of Heinz ketchup or Harry Potter? And I still tell him, I've probably mentioned this to you before. Yeah, that floored me. Because you say, well, where's Harry Potter? It's just a story. It's not real. Like you can't, it's nothing physical you can touch. But if you went to every single person in that restaurant, they would all know Harry, Ron, Hermione, Hogwarts, Hagrid. So what's real? And that's his argument for the existence of God, which I haven't necessarily come up with a counterpoint. But like narrative being the most fundamental thing, or like for a different podcast, like Lex and what's that guy's name? Robert Breedlove. One time we're on a podcast and they were just like, Breedlove is like, yeah, information is like the most fundamental substrate of reality. And so that's to your point, like information, whatever. That is the first thing it makes me think of. The second thing it makes me think of is the original Venkatesh Uvazification essay. Because what he's his thing at the end of that is that like no matter what value you hold dear, what was the thing he said? He said having the thing that desires change ultimately gets changed itself. So no matter what group is trying to like harness AI and point it towards like so these predefined values that are defined as good, the agent itself always gets undercut and changes itself. And so his point, that's what's startling about the Uzification essay. That's why I don't like tell many people about it or like try to tell friends or family about it, because it's really unsettling. It's just, he's like, at the end of the day, zooming out far enough, there is no solid ground, and all the values and things you'll dear will get Uzified. And I remember texting you, I was like, I think he's just right on some very fine level.
Yeah.
Now, you could argue that it's just, you can zoom out to any scale. I always like thinking of the size of the universe. You just zoom out to the size of the universe, say, hey, everything happening on Earth is irrelevant. So you could argue against that move of zooming out to that level of Uzification, but I also think he's right. So it's, yeah, dude, it's pretty unsettling. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I don't have a conclusion or something. It's just like, wow, yeah, I see where you're coming from on that point.
Do you want to go to top of the hour? Is that a good cutoff?
Yeah, sure, that works.
Okay. Maybe we can squeeze in the Techno Optimist Manifesto, but I think this kind of, I'm seeing a way that it relates to this conversation, but I wonder if we should first give context on like what it is and our reactions to it.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I guess I could start. Just Marc Andreessen wrote this piece, the Techno Optimist Manifesto, just talking about how technology is and progress is this force largely for good, and if we continue to develop technology, it will bring basically panacea or just extremely valuable benefits to society, and the people who want to fight this are necessarily in favor of contraction, and there's a huge cost to fighting or pushing back against technological development, whether that's through sort of climate change or ESG type of angle, or he kind of lumps in controversially, he lumps in the AI existential risk group with that. I mean, it's painting pretty broad strokes, but yeah, it's just saying how valuable technological growth is to humans. I know there's like sub points I'm missing, but it's just at its highest level that technological growth is extremely positive, and we should pursue it kind of with reckless abandon. I mean, he maybe has a few constraints in there. You probably have any other points I missed of the specifics of why this stuff is so valuable.
Yeah, I think he brings up two supporting points. One is like just this total faith in markets and how markets have been reliably been able to let technology develop. And generally increase our quality of life. Like over, if sure, there's all these little moments where technology goes wrong, but if you zoom out, through all of history, technology has led to a higher and higher standard of living, and it will continue to do so. So we should, yeah, so that like that's the reason to continue pursuing. And
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
kind of right at the edge of reaching a point where we have this radical abundance where all of our problems are solved.
Yep. And he talks about uh like intelligence becoming too cheap to meter, and how economic growth leads to vitality, expansion of life, increasing of knowledge. And then if you do the opposite, if you fight it, it just leads to decay. And you basically, you're either growing, you're dying. And we need to just become these technological supermen and embrace technological growth and markets. And he actually calls I texted his one friend, he goes, "No, it's interesting. That enemy section was a little weird." And he actually calls all these forces pushing back against this literally the enemy.
Right.
Yeah. I was inspired reading this, like very inspired. I texted a bunch of people about it. I read well, first of all, there was the cheap shots from TechCrunch saying how, yeah, he's never talked to a poor person yet. He grew up really poor. Andreessen grew up really poor. And those people, yeah, he grew up in like Wisconsin, and the people writing, somebody went and looked at like the bios of like the people writing the like, has Marc Andreessen never talked to a poor person article, and they all went to like these prep schools in New York and expensive, Ivy League schools and all that. So that was pretty funny. But there are really legitimate criticisms, which at first glance, I was just like, let's go. This is, I'm so behind this. I heard really interesting pushback on him lumping existential risk in with the other, contraction, degrowth type groups. There's probably other pushback too. Like what did you have? I think you had a few things a few points of disagreement here.
Yeah, I think like I'd say like almost all of my technology essays published on Substack are all optimistic. It's like, hey, here's this thing people are scared of. Here's why it's going to be good. So I'd say like I'm generally in the camp of being really pro technology. I'd say that it is definitely a manifesto, and like a manifesto usually is like it's a point that's made like very much on one side of the fence, and it's very much anti-Luddite. Like I got the sense that this was like, hey, there's actually a lot of people saying we should slow down. Like there have been actual proposed bans to just shut down all the factories, and like people go as far as say we need to nuke the gas-fired facilities because it's going to lead to this monster, and it's just like this extreme overreaction from the Luddites. And I see this as Marc's counterpoint, which is also very extreme. Like we should just like push intelligence and energy to infinity with just pure faith in the markets. And I think my general pushback is like the techno optimist I would trust the most is the one who can best articulate the dangers of technology and also the nuanced solutions we need to get around it. And I just thought that by writing a manifesto, you're actually not finding the middle ground. You're kind of just, it creates this like tribal war in a way,
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting to think about his intention behind writing it in the style of the manifesto. Actually, David had done this, How I Write, interviewed them right before that. And I think it's maybe offline, but they talked about the fact, I don't know if it was part of the episode or not, I don't remember, but they talked about how he went back and read other great manifestos and was like drawing on, it was very deliberately called the manifesto, and he was drawing on.
That wasn't the podcast, by the way.
It wasn't the podcast. Okay, right. And so, that's, yeah, it's a certain style. And I guess the question is, would Marc, upon further reflection, have some of those nuances that don't belong in a manifesto? It's kind of like when you tweet, if you have every caveat and whatever in there, it weakens your message, is not going to go anywhere. So people have to have this really like spiky points of view, even if it's not the full representation of their thinking. So I wonder what he would think. This one guy, I don't know if you've seen this writer, Zvi, I think it's pronounced ZVI. Tyler Cowen likes him a lot. Pretty bright guy, seemingly. And he just had an all-time takedown of Andreessen's thing. It really gave me some second thoughts on it, in that he basically just says Andreessen is like this, can be at times a sloppy thinker who sort of says things that, like particularly existential risk pieces of this, that were just sort of not well thought out. And I know a lot of people on Twitter will criticize him for all the Web3 stuff he was pushing a couple years ago, and there's some pretty big takedowns of some of the points he made back then. Anyways, it's just, yeah, I guess my question is, behind the scenes, does he have a more nuanced take that just he felt didn't belong in manifesto, or is he just sort of blindly and wholeheartedly, hey, let's hit the gas here and markets will kind of be enough guardrails. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think based on his position, like he's probably in the all-in camp. Like he has the capital and the brand and the network to actually just fund all these companies and kind of literally be at the spearhead of this movement. So I could see him. I mean, I'm sure he has some nuanced takes, but I think he's very much like anti-Luddite, pro push everything to the limits, and I think very anti-regulation, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the part that most resonated with me, and I shared this with the Rite of Passage team, was one of the parts he talks about ideas. You know, when somebody crafts an idea, it's this net new entity in the world, and then ideas can combine with other ideas and lead to very real positive consequences. And he talks about the marketplace of ideas, and naturally that dovetails with exactly what we're building at Rite of Passage. It's very, my message to the team was it placed what we're doing in this broader context as a force for good. Of, you know, we had 650, we might have hit 700 published articles in this most recent Rite of Passage cohort. Those are new ideas out in the world that can go. You see it on Substack every day. They go combine with other ideas. People meet for these ideas, and so for me and for what we're doing at Rite of Passage, it's so gratifying or exciting to be placed as, you know, a piece of this larger vision that he shares. And so I really resonate with that. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe he is just sort of almost entirely, I mean, the manifesto would suggest that he's just entirely in favor of just pushing it here. What did you think about the existential AI risk? Did you hear that criticism that he just does one wave of the hand and lumps that risk in with like climate change, degrowth, ESG? Do you feel that is a wrong move on his part?
I think so. I would like to write a paper that is almost like satirically the opposite. Whereas I'd love to make the case, the extreme Luddite, like a really convincing case. And I actually believe this in a way too, where I think if you were to zoom out and you ran 100 simulations, I think in most cases humanity will destroy itself because of technology. So I actually, as pro technology as I am, I do think I think his manifesto is flawed, because I think like when you're in history, right, in that arc, it is true that capitalism will breed a higher quality of life, and that there will be all of these, like, you know, cases where technology goes wrong, but it's not powerful enough to really matter. But when you get into this world of exponential, I think there are a lot of different ways in which the side effects of technological growth can destabilize the whole. And I think this is the century where we actually enter that chasm of like supreme risk. And in the end, the point I want to make is that, like, it's not about pure capitalism or just like complete regulation. We actually, like, intelligent life needs to create some sort of novel social structure outside of capitalism, outside of socialism, that can allow technology to be safely developed. And so in the end, it is a nuanced point where I think we should keep pushing forward, but we should be figuring out the social structures that enable us to safely move forward.
It's the central question of our time, is it not? Like that question. And the you know, I've been really interested in these guys, Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke and Daniel Schmachtenberger, and they talk about this all the time. And Schmachtenberger has this very clean way of saying, you know, if you have exponentially accelerating technology with exponentially decreasing ability to sense make, he just says that drives you off a cliff. And leave it to the listener to unpack the details of what driving off a cliff entails, but it's not good. My question with him is always, what's the timescale of that? And also, it's just hard to live your life like holding that in your head every single day. You just kind of have to live your life at some point. But they talk about this stuff a lot. And then, you know, Vervaeke in particular with the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and after Socrates, he does these big YouTube series. He just unpacks this, like, what does it look? I think he calls it like the religion that's not a religion. He's working on like this new way of organizing and creating meaning. It's been called Game B. I know we've talked about it in the past. I guess the other option is to return to religion. There's this big thing going around this week. This woman at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, I forget her name, but she was raised in Nairobi, Kenya. She was a Muslim, and then she was an atheist, and then she just became a Christian. And she was talking about more like a geopolitical lens of, like, as the things happening in Israel, Gaza, and Russia and China. She wants to have these Western roots of Christianity, and she wants people to return to those. And obviously, David became a Christian. Like there is this move of more people turning
Totally.
existing religion. So that's a question: is it do you go back to the existing religion? And she actually has a line in her article about why she became a Christian. She said it's not going to be some mixture of meditation and mindfulness. It's not some new thing. We got to return to the old thing. I mean, that's a fundamental fork in the road for me personally. Is it the new thing or the old thing? I can see both sides on different days. I think it's pretty commendable that Vervaeke's trying to grapple with this new thing, but there is this 2,000 years of, cultural wisdom to tap into. And is that enough? Or has that already been undercut and you need to go to the new thing? I don't know, man, but I guess it's, can you create these new structures to integrate this safely? And that's basically the question of our time. And who knows? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think like it could be a mix of the two. Like a psychedelic Christianity is both very new with the very old, but in the end, the whole idea of sense making, I feel like that's obviously a huge problem, and that affects the average person, the general culture that we're in, which affects the institutions too. But also, I just think like politics, government, markets, that's a very separate thing from what people believe and what gives people meaning. It's almost in the realm of like the Communist Manifesto or the Wealth of Nations or the separation of powers. Like there's some innovation we're missing in political science that I think is necessary to accommodate exponential technology.
That's interesting.
And I think if I were to describe what it is, I think we need to reinvent like the separation of powers, judicial, legislative, executive. That might be the triad we need, but we haven't updated it with our technology. So imagine a new form of government where the judicial branch is AI, like a super intelligence is judicial, and then you have some social system through a DAO where it's actually a pure democracy that proposes laws to this super intelligent judicial AI. And then, but people are temporarily elected to actually execute the decisions made by the intelligence, because you can't trust the machine to have the final power. I'm not saying that's exactly it, but it's like,
that's quite interesting.
Yeah. I think it's some sort of innovation on that to allow all emerging technology to properly kind of work in our.
And at what level? Is this at the level of the nation state, or is this like a reconception of like the division of separation of powers within the United States, or right? Like what level is this? Or is this network?
I think it's post nation state, right? It's like you almost need both consumer unions. Like imagine if 30 million people got together and says, we're not going to use Facebook unless you join the system. And then Facebook, additionally, it's a game-based system where both Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, whoever, they actually have business incentives to join this collective versus trying to operate on the side. So it's like, it's really a matter of like game theory and politics and the development of technology. Imagine if you had social scientists who had the biggest sway in Twitter's algorithm versus their business interest,
Yeah, man, it's interesting. Well, what's interesting about that is that there's this merging what you're describing of governance, but then it's at like a private company. But there's these private companies that have such power now that they almost need to be treated, regulated, or whatever the word is, like through the lens of governance rather than just as like a private company. I think that's what you're getting at, right? Like it's these checks on a private. You're describing a private company.
But they also, this is why it's still really pro-capitalist, because they need to be sovereign, and they need to rationally and willingly join the collective versus being coerced or regulated to not cause harm. They can actually benefit the company by joining this protocol.
That's really interesting. Well, I like that you distinguish between this thing you're describing versus like Vervaeke trying to invent the religion that's not a religion or so. They're both central questions of the coming century, but one is very difficult but more tractable than the other, more approachable than the other one, relatively speaking. I mean, like trying to reinvent a new orientation towards the human condition is about the hardest thing you can try to do. I would say. That's up there. Whereas the second thing you're describing is some version like network state meets sovereign individual, which is very interesting. When I really think about it, it's kind of like the most interesting thing of our age. I was looking at a lot of the network state stuff that Balaji did that conference October 30th this year. He did this conference in Amsterdam. Actually, there's 3 different Rite of Passage alums who all spoke at that. I thought that was pretty cool. Alex Grin, he was in cohort 5 and he's part of Cabin with Jonathan Hillis and
Nice.
formerly Zach Fleischman. I was just with him this week. And then Spencer McDonald was this guy I used to have calls with back in cohort 5. I had no clue. He founded this cybersecurity company that sort of intersects with the network state idea somewhere. And then Priya, I forget his last name or something. She was a cohort 11 student. I forget actually what she was speaking about, but somebody pointed out she was an alum as well. Anyways, yeah. I just think this network state, sovereign individual, it's like the most interesting thing, really. I mean, unless you want to go try to tackle the human condition thing, which I'm interested in what they're doing. It's a lot to try to be the group that tries to take that on. And so obviously, honestly, probably easier just in your own life to return to a traditional religion if you want some answer there. But the network state stuff to me is like the richest, most interesting think about right now. And I at least for myself personally right now, Rite of Passage, it's like we can get people who are writing. I would love to partner with Balaji and like have writers similar to what we do with Roots of Progress who write about network state. It's something that's
cool. That'd be awesome.
But I love how what we're doing with Rite of Passage has a real relevance in it's just creating new ideas. And at the end of the day, what you're describing is just new ideas. It's just the thing limiting what you're describing is ideas that people can come up with between their ears. Like what new ideas are out. Vitalik, I know, has talked a lot about, he has this thing called like quadratic voting and all these very clever ways to like,
I've heard of that.
I mean, far be it for me to try to explain it right now. It's I heard about it one time. He explains it pretty well. I just can't remember right now. But anyways, my point is there are smart people who are trying to take these things on, and that's all it'll ever be is just people thinking of things to try and experiment with, and whether that's the network state or it is some experimentation in local US politics, or it's more like a private sector thing like you were describing. Who knows what final form it takes, but it's quite exciting to think about what's going to change there.
Yeah, totally. And just to tie it back to the manifestos, that's why I think it's really worth articulating. Here's the profound upside and the profound downside, so that we know we have to approach it. Like the solution emerges in the middle of the two. Like we have to go forward, but we have to solve this problem in order to actually realize it.
Yeah, 100%. It would be interesting what the network state crowd thought of the Techno Optimist Manifesto, because the thing what I like about them, and somebody pointed this out about what's so great about that conference is that somebody tweeted this, but it's just like they're actually doing the thing. Like everyone who spoke at that conference, it was 7 hours straight, a 1-day conference, and every single person who spoke was a founder or co-founder of a company in that, or a DAO or whatever in that space. And so it's taking it from the theoretical to the practical. Like they're actually out there in battle testing their theories in the marketplace of ideas and getting customers or citizens or, crypto citizens or whatever it is. And so it needs to be that way. And obviously, I mean, Mark has a lot of investments, but the Techno Optimist Manifesto it's fairly abstract, theoretical. It's purely at the level of ideas, at least the way he presented it. He's doing real stuff too, but that particular manifesto is at the level of ideas. And I'd be very curious what the network state people think of that, because it's sort of where the rubber is hitting the road versus more the like broad sweeping 100-year time frame theory. You know what I mean? It's like, what's that intersection?
Malachi has the book too, if you think about it. Yeah. Network state is the theory, and then
it started. Yeah.
Practical.
What has to? It starts with the words, but then it becomes real, right? Like
right.
It started with the Declaration of Independence, and that was just words, but then it became real, as a nation, as a new nation state. So yeah, the network state reminded me. What it reminded me of is, I would have to go into history to see the exact thing, but I know there was, there's the Continental Congress, but like even before that, I'm sure Virginia, like the 1750s, like the House of Burgesses was meeting and like talking about how like the Virginia colony should be governed. Like there was these early rumblings in the 1700s in the colonies. And then there was something called the Committees of Correspondence. And then that eventually became, the Declaration, the first Constitutional Convention. Like it was all these dominoes that tipped that eventually led to the war and the new nation and all that. And so I really had a sense that this network state conference was this early rumbling. You go find whatever 1752, Virginia House of Burgesses meeting with James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, or whatever. But it felt like that to me. And I don't know when the next one is, but I plan to go to it, and maybe we could both go or something. It seems fun.
So, where was it?
It was in Amsterdam. It was also during the cohort. If it wasn't during the cohort, I bet I would try to check out. But in the future, that's the type of, I want to be in those rooms. It's really, exciting. It's so dynamic, and it's that feeling I got when I first read The Sovereign Individual. It's just wild, radiant possibility of the future. So
Yeah. Dude, I would love to read a curation. Maybe we can close on this point, but I would love to read a curation on all of the works of writing about technology through history and how that served as a rallying flag to then have an influence in the real world. Even in the last 30 years, there was like a Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace written in 1995.
there you go.
Wow. So yeah, it's neat how writing is really the starting point.
Yeah.
You need to kind of actually freeze your vision into words for other people to say, hey, me too, let's go build something.
Well, if narrative and language is the information is the fundamental substrate, then how could it be any other way? Right. Wow. Amazing, man. Let's leave it there. It's an all-timer. It's just so good. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the techno optimist thing we could do an entire episode on probably, but I think that was a pretty good take on it. And yeah, we'll just keep reading stuff and this again in 2 weeks. So
yeah, I think it'll come out in the next few weeks. So
no, buckle up. We'll see. So
dude, I'm sure we'll have the GPT marketplace by then.
Yeah. Oh, we got to talk about that. I want to experiment that myself as well. I mean, like, man, what could I cook up for just Chinese language learning? I'm sure you got ideas for what you could do, writing, music. It's an exciting time. So, all right, leave it there. Stuff, man.
Yeah, so.
All right.